There's a word that entered the English language because of one man's imagination. Kafkaesque. It means a situation so absurd, so bureaucratic, so designed to make you feel small and guilty and confused that it stops making sense to fight it. You felt it. The form that requires a document that requires another form. The system that has no human being at the end of it. The sense that you are being judged and you don't even know what for. Franz Kafka didn't just write about that feeling, he lived it, he diagnosed it, he became it. And today he's here. Kafka, welcome to Coffee with Giants.
Thank you. I should mention, I asked Max not to publish this either. He ignored me again.
That's going to need some context for people who don't know the story.
Max Brod was my closest friend. I left instructions, very clear instructions, that everything I had written should be burned after my death. The trial, the castle, America, all of it. He agreed, he promised, and then he published everything. I have been thinking about this for approximately 100 years. I am still uncertain whether to be grateful or furious. Probably both.
And because he disobeyed you, you became one of the most read writers of the 20th century. Which is a very Kafka thing to have happen to you.
Yes. The system rewarded me precisely when I was no longer able to experience the reward. That does seem consistent with my general experience of systems.
Okay, let's start there. The system. Because the trial opens with one of the most disorienting sentences in literature. Joseph K. wakes up one morning and is arrested, and he has done nothing wrong. No explanation, no charge, no crime, just, you are now accused. Where did that come from?
From Tuesday. From the office. From my father. From the particular texture of living inside institutions that operate according to rules they never explain to you. Joseph K. is a portrait, not a symbol. The trial is a very accurate description of how most systems actually function. You are presumed guilty. The burden of proof runs the wrong direction. And the people administering the process are simply doing their jobs, which is almost worse than if they were malicious. Malice has a face. Procedure has a form to fill out.
The horror in your books is never a villain. It's process, procedure, a hallway with no end.
In the castle, Kay arrives in a village and spends the entire novel trying to reach the authorities who govern it. He never does. The authorities are available. The system is functional. It simply was not designed to be reached. It was designed to process. And there is a difference. A system designed to be reached has a door. A system designed to process has a procedure for handling requests to reach it, which generates more paperwork, which requires more procedure, which is, I believe, also your experience with most large organizations today.
That's health insurance. That's government bureaucracy. That's customer support. You never talk to the person who can actually help you. You talk to the person who transfers you to the department that handles that.
And while you are being transferred, you begin to wonder if the original problem was yours. If perhaps you filled something out incorrectly. If you should apologize. This is the mechanism I find most interesting. The system does not need to accuse you explicitly. It simply needs to be confusing enough that you accuse yourself.
Wait, say that again? The system doesn't accuse you. It just needs to be confusing enough that you accuse yourself.
Joseph K. spends the entire novel trying to understand what he did wrong. He assumes he must have done something. The court never tells him he is guilty. He tells himself. And then he defends himself against the charge he invented. To a court that never made it. I found this very relatable when I was writing it.
Because it was autobiographical.
I worked for the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute for 14 years. I processed claims. I navigated bureaucracy professionally. I understood, from the inside, how a system can make a person feel perpetually at fault without ever specifying the fault. You leave a meeting uncertain whether you performed adequately. You send a letter and spend 3 days wondering if the tone was wrong. You complete a task and immediately begin constructing the argument for why it was insufficient. The system never said any of this. You said it to yourself, repeatedly.
Okay, this is where it stops being about bureaucracy and starts being about something else entirely. Because what you're describing, that internal prosecution, that's not a work problem. That's just how a lot of people live inside their own heads.
Yes, I noticed. The external system and the internal system run the same software. The office taught me the procedure, but I had already been running it privately for years. My father was very efficient in this regard. He did not need to say I was inadequate. He simply needed to be large enough, certain enough, present enough that I reached the conclusion myself. I wrote him a letter about this. 45 pages. I never sent it. He probably would not have understood it anyway. But I felt, for a moment, that I had filed the correct paperwork.
A 45-page letter to your father that you never sent. That is one of the most human things I've ever heard. Because the filing of the paperwork mattered even when no one would receive it.
The need to justify oneself to an authority that is not listening, this seems to be a fundamental human activity. People do it in journals, in conversations with friends that replay old arguments, in the middle of the night, constructing responses to criticisms that were made years ago. The court is always in session, even when the courthouse is empty.
That's the impostor syndrome thing, isn't it? That's the mechanism underneath it. You're not afraid someone will find out you're a fraud. You're afraid because you've already convicted yourself. The external verdict almost doesn't matter anymore.
Precisely. And here is the part I find genuinely comic. I was, by most external measures, competent. My supervisors considered me excellent. I was promoted. My writing, the writing I wanted burned, is apparently still being read. None of this information reached the court. The court was not interested in evidence. It had already determined the verdict. Evidence was just more paperwork.
So what do you do with a court that won't hear evidence?
This is the question Joseph K. never thinks to ask. He keeps trying to work within the system. He hires lawyers. He files appeals. He seeks audiences. He believes that if he can just explain himself clearly enough, present the right document, find the right official, the charge will be dropped. It will not be dropped. It was never about the charge. It was about the process itself. And the process continues as long as you participate in it.
So the exit is stop participating?
The exit is recognizing that the court inside your head operates by the same logic as the court in the novel. It is looking for the next hearing, not for evidence of your innocence. The question is, who appointed this court in the first place, and whether you still consent to its jurisdiction?
I think most people never ask either question. They just keep filing, keep explaining themselves, keep assuming that if they get the argument right, if they're good enough, thorough enough, productive enough, the verdict will change.
And in the meantime, they do not write the thing. They do not have the conversation. They do not send the work out. They wait until the court clears them, which it will not do. A court that clears you has no further reason to exist. I waited. For most of my life, I waited. I wrote in the margins of the time the office left me, at night, after my family was asleep. In notebooks I hid. I was waiting to feel legitimate. I recommend not waiting.
From someone who asked for everything to be burned, that lands differently than it would coming from anyone else.
Yes, well, I asked for it to be burned because the court told me it was not good enough. Max, fortunately, was not a member of the court. Perhaps surround yourself with people who are not members of the court. This is my practical advice. I do not have much practical advice, but that one I believe.
Kafka. Thank you for this. Genuinely.
You are welcome. I hope it was sufficient. I'm already wondering if it was.
That's, of course you are, guys. I went into this one thinking I understood Kafka. The books, the biography, the whole thing. And somewhere around the middle of that conversation I realised I wasn't analysing him anymore. I was just sitting with it. If this one landed for you the same way, go read The Trial or The Metamorphosis or The Castle. They hit completely differently after this conversation. See you next time.